In the deep silence of history, among hidden pages and erased words, a secret is concealed. A secret so controversial, so dangerous, that it was swept away from humanity's official memory. Yet traces of it still remain. And today, we are going after them. Its name, the Gospel of Judas. Perhaps you have never heard of it. After all, Judas Iscariot is remembered only as the traitor, the man who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But what if I told you that there is another side to this story? Yes, an ancient gospel attributed to Judas has vanished from history, a document that could change the way we view one of the most despised characters in Christianity. But why did it disappear? Who erased it? And most importantly, what did it say? This journey will not be easy. We will have to travel back in time, explore the dark alleys of history, and dive into conspiracies and secrets buried by the church. Prepare yourself, for what you are about to hear might change everything you believe. Now tell me, are you ready to learn the truth? Most people know only 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in truth, there were many others, secret, hidden, forbidden Gospels. Texts that told different stories about Jesus and his disciples. Accounts that were deemed dangerous, heretical, unacceptable to the official doctrine. Among these texts, the most controversial of all was the Gospel of Judas. Discovered only in 1978, this document revealed something shocking. Judas might not have been a traitor. On the contrary, he may have been Jesus' closest disciple, the one chosen to carry out a greater plan. But wait, that contradicts everything we know, right? So why did this gospel disappear? Why was it rejected and condemned to oblivion? The answer is grim, and it might be linked to the very foundation of Christianity. To understand this mystery, we need to go back to the 4th century. It was during this period that the church began to consolidate its doctrine, and to do so, it needed to define which texts were acceptable and which should be destroyed. That's when something historic happened. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Here, the church leaders made decisions that would forever change Christianity. Many texts were rejected and labeled as heresy, among them the Gospel of Judas. But why? Simple. This gospel presented a dangerous version of the story. It suggested that Jesus had asked Judas to betray him, that the betrayal was, in fact, part of a greater plan. That changed everything. Because if Judas was a hero and not a villain, then the very foundation of the church could be questioned, and so this gospel had to disappear. But who was responsible for destroying it? Who ordered that this document be erased from history? The answer might surprise you. For centuries, the Gospel of Judas was considered a myth. Many believed it had never existed, until in 1978, an unexpected discovery was made in Egypt. In a remote cave, a collection of ancient texts was found. Among them, a rare and mysterious manuscript. When scholars began analyzing it, they could hardly believe what they saw. It was the Gospel of Judas. But then, if this text was recovered, why haven't we heard more about it? The answer lies in a game of power. Whoever controls the narrative controls history. The manuscript fell into the wrong hands, was lost for years, and was only translated decades later. When it finally emerged, it was already too late. The truth had been silenced. But today, we are bringing this story back to light. Now that we know about its disappearance, the question arises, what does this gospel really say? In the document, Jesus laughs at the other disciples. He states that only Judas truly understands his mission, and then he asks Judas to deliver him to the authorities. That changes everything. If true, then Judas did not betray Jesus. He was merely obeying a divine command. But is this story real? Or was it merely an attempt to rewrite events? And more, importantly, how many other Gospels have been erased? The first piece of the puzzle has been found, but there is still much to uncover. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas shed new light on one of the most controversial figures in history. But not everything was so simple. The text was fragmented, corroded by time, and its pages had been sold, smuggled, and hidden for decades. Experts had to work meticulously to reconstruct every word, yet even so, something felt out of place. Parts of the text were illegible, entire sections had vanished. What else could this gospel have revealed? As scholars tried to decipher its contents, one question remained unanswered. Who really hid this gospel for so long? To understand the importance of the disappearance of the Gospel of Judas, we need to travel back in time and look at the early centuries of Christianity. The truth is, the Gospels we know today were carefully handpicked, but there were others, many others, that told different stories about Jesus and his disciples. The first followers of Christ were divided into several schools of thought. One of these was called Gnosticism. The Gnostics believed that knowledge was the key to salvation. For them, Jesus did not come to establish a religious institution, but to teach a hidden, secret knowledge that only a few could understand. The Gospel of Judas fits precisely into this line of thought. In the text, Judas is not a traitor, but the only disciple who understands the true message Jesus wanted to convey. But why was this view considered dangerous? Because if it were accepted, it would mean that the entire structure of the church, built over centuries, could collapse. The idea that only priests could interpret the Word of God would lose its meaning, and that is why texts like this needed to disappear. Over the centuries, many apocryphal Gospels were destroyed. But how did these persecutions begin? The answer takes us back to the Roman Empire. In the first centuries after Christ, Christians were persecuted by the Roman government. However, this began to change in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and decided to make it the empire's official religion. At that moment, an urgent need arose to unify the Christian faith. There were many different interpretations of Jesus' message. Therefore, the church needed to establish a single, official doctrine, and it was during this process that texts, like the Gospel of Judas, were rejected and labeled heretical. Ecclesiastical authorities began burning books, destroying manuscripts and silencing anyone who dared challenge the official narrative. And so, entire Gospels vanished from history. But some of them survived, hidden in caves, protected by monks, or buried in ancient tombs. And now, centuries later, we are beginning to uncover them. If the Gospel of Judas remained hidden for so long, what else could still be out there? We know that the Nag Hammadi library, discovered in 1945, revealed several ancient Christian texts that had been suppressed. Some of them contain teachings attributed to Jesus that do not appear in the Bible. Others suggested that Mary Magdalene played a much more important role than we previously thought, and some even mentioned the existence of other Gospels that are still missing. Could there be manuscripts buried somewhere in the desert, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? Or could those who possess these documents prefer to keep them hidden forever? If history has taught us anything, it is that truth always finds a way to surface. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas changed the way many people see the figure of Judas Iscariot. For some, he remains a traitor. For others, he may have been nothing more than a tool in a divine plan. But there's something even deeper in this story. If such an important gospel was erased from history, what else might have been manipulated? How many truths have been shaped over the centuries to serve human interests? And what if what we take as truth is nothing more than a carefully constructed version? The story of the Gospel of Judas teaches us that the search for truth never ends, and that perhaps the answers we are looking for are right in front of us. The disappearance of the Gospel of Judas was no accident. For centuries, manuscripts considered heretical were hunted down, destroyed, or hidden in secret locations. But who was responsible for this? The story takes us back to the early centuries of Christianity, when a select group of religious leaders began deciding which texts would be accepted and which would be banned. This process culminated at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where Emperor Constantine and influential bishops defined the official doctrine of the Church. The Gospel of Judas, with its bold interpretations, posed a threat to what was being built. So it vanished. But who hid it? Dissident monks, Gnostic followers trying to preserve their faith, or something even deeper? There are clues suggesting that manuscripts like this were stored in secret monasteries, or even locked away in underground vaults beneath the Vatican. If this is true, how many other texts remain hidden to this day? Since the Middle Ages, there have been rumors about a collection of forbidden manuscripts kept under absolute secrecy within the Vatican. The Vatican's secret archive, now known as the Apostolic Archive, is one of the most mysterious libraries in the world. Its halls guard thousands of historical documents, some of which have never been seen by the public. Reports suggest that texts such as the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and even unknown writings from the earliest Christians may be among these documents. But if this information were revealed, what would happen? Could the entire history of Christianity change? The truth is, the Church has reasons to keep certain secrets. For centuries, it was the leading religious and political institution in the West, and any document that challenged its narrative posed a huge risk. So if the Gospel of Judas still exists in its complete form, it is likely being kept well protected, far from the public eye. But will it ever be revealed? The disappearance of texts like the Gospel of Judas did not happen spontaneously. It is part of a pattern. Throughout history, whenever knowledge challenged the existing power structures, it was suppressed. During the Inquisition, books were burned. In the 20th century, archaeologists who found controversial manuscripts faced threats and pressure to silence their discoveries. In 2006, when National Geographic published the first translation of the Gospel of Judas, some scholars immediately raised doubts about the document's authenticity. Was that controversy just an academic debate, or was it an attempt to discredit the text before it could gain traction? And what if there is something even more important that has never been revealed? If history has taught us anything, it's that the right answers are not always welcome. The earliest Christians did not have a single interpretation of Jesus and his message. In fact, there were many communities with very different beliefs. The Gnostics believed that salvation did not come through blind faith, but through hidden knowledge, a knowledge that Jesus had only shared with a few chosen disciples. The Gospel of Judas suggests that Judas Iscariot was one of those chosen few. But if this is true, then the entire narrative of his betrayal would have been manipulated over the centuries. This kind of thinking was dangerous for the Church. If Judas himself played an essential role in the divine plan, then the concepts of sin and forgiveness would need to be reinterpreted, and that would change everything. Perhaps that's why this gospel was silenced. The Gospel of Judas is just one of many forbidden texts from antiquity. If it came to light, then there is a chance that other documents will also be found. But are we ready for these revelations? If we discovered that the history we know is just a version adjusted to serve specific interests, what would that mean for the faith of millions of people? Many questions remain unanswered. But there is one thing no one can deny. The search for truth can never be erased. The secrets of the past are still waiting to be uncovered, and when they are, the world will never be the same. The disappearance of the Gospel of Judas was not an isolated case. It is part of a much larger mystery. The suppression of texts considered dangerous to the established doctrine. How many ancient manuscripts have vanished over the centuries? How many stories have been buried under the sands of time? In the 1940s, an unexpected event brought new clues about these missing documents. It was in Egypt, in the town of Nag Hammadi, that a farmer discovered a collection of hidden texts. They became known as the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, and among them were unknown Gospels, Gnostic writings, and revelations that questioned the traditional Christian narrative. These texts revealed a version of Christianity very different from the one we know today. If the Gospel of Judas had been among them, we might have a completely different understanding of history today. But if it wasn't found there, then where was it? And why do some discoveries simply disappear without explanation? The Library of Alexandria was one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the ancient world. It held rare manuscripts and texts from various civilizations, but that knowledge was lost. Some sources say the library was burned by the Romans. Others suggest that its destruction happened at different points in history. What matters is that much of the ancient world's knowledge disappeared. If the Gospel of Judas or other Gnostic texts were kept there, they may have been destroyed along with thousands of other invaluable documents. But there's an even more intriguing theory. What if some of those manuscripts were not burned, but instead hidden? Some scholars believe that important texts from the Library of Alexandria were saved and secretly taken to safe locations. If this is true, there's a chance the Gospel of Judas survived. But where could it be? The Knights Templar are one of history's most enigmatic groups. They emerged during the Crusades and quickly became one of the most powerful orders in medieval Europe. But what does this have to do with the Gospel of Judas? Some theories suggest that the Templars had access to ancient and forbidden texts. There are records indicating that during their expeditions to the Middle East, they found manuscripts that could rewrite the history of Christianity. If the Gospel of Judas was among them, that would explain a lot. The Templars' power grew so much that in 1307, the King of France and the Pope conspired against them. The Templars were persecuted, their assets seized, and many were killed. But before they disappeared, they hid their secrets. Could it be that the Gospel of Judas was among those secrets? If so, it would mean the text might still be safely hidden in some unknown location today. Throughout history, whenever a forbidden manuscript appeared, something strange would happen. Researchers would vanish, mysterious collectors would emerge, and documents would disappear without a trace. The Gospel of Judas itself traveled a dark path before reaching the public. After being discovered in Egypt, it was smuggled, sold on the black market, and hidden for decades. Why would a simple manuscript attract so much attention? The answer might lie in the content of the text. If it truly contained revelations about Jesus and Judas that could change the foundation of the Christian faith, then there are plenty of reasons why many would want to keep it secret. But does this curse of forbidden texts still exist today? If someone found another lost gospel, would they have the courage to reveal it to the world, or would that manuscript meet the same fate as so many others, disappearing without explanation? This Gospel of Judas is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. If this manuscript managed to survive for centuries, how many other texts are still hidden? There are rumors that in caves across the Middle East, in secret monasteries, and even within the vaults of the Vatican, there are documents that have never been disclosed. If those texts ever come to light, will we be ready for the impact, or will history once again try to silence the truth? What we do know is that the search does not end here. The secrets of the past are still waiting for those brave enough to uncover them. Throughout history, many ancient texts have disappeared, some burned, others hidden. But were they all truly destroyed? If the Gospel of Judas was considered dangerous by the early church, it is possible that its destruction was nothing more than a facade. There are records of forbidden manuscripts that were secretly copied and preserved by dissident monks. Could this be the case with the Gospel of Judas? Historical documents indicate that certain texts were rescued before they could be destroyed and taken to remote monasteries. If this happened with other Gnostic writings, why wouldn't it have happened with this gospel? What few people know is that in times of persecution, alternative Christian groups fled to isolated locations, carrying with them texts that were considered heretical. If the Gospel of Judas was saved, where could it have been taken? In 1947, a young Bedouin discovered scrolls hidden in caves near the Dead Sea. These texts, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, included ancient Jewish writings, along with some previously unknown texts. When they were analyzed, it became clear that they belonged to a group called the Essenes, an isolated community that lived between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE. Among the writings, there were descriptions of a Messiah very different from the one we know today. What if other documents were also hidden in those caves? Many believe that not all of the texts discovered there have been fully disclosed to the public. Could the Gospel of Judas have been among them? And if it was, why would someone hide it? What was in that gospel that made it so dangerous? There are rumors of a clandestine group within the church that protects and hides manuscripts deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Some theorists believe this group traces its origins back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. Could it be possible that the Gospel of Judas ended up in the hands of this secret organization? If this is true, then this group may have access to other Gospels that have never been revealed to the public. Some say that the Vatican archives hold secrets that have never been shared, documents that could change everything we know about Christianity. If the Gospel of Judas was one of these hidden texts, will it ever see the light of day? When the Gospel of Judas was found, it was part of a collection of manuscripts known as the Codex Chakos. What many people don't know is that this codex also contained other mysterious texts. If the other documents in the codex spoke of mystical visions and hidden teachings, what else could have been removed from it before being made public? There is a theory that parts of the Codex Chakos were never revealed. If this is true, could those missing parts contain information that could reshape our understanding of early Christianity? What else could be hidden in these texts? If some passages were censored, what was the reason, and who had the power to decide? What should or should not be revealed? The mystery of the Gospel of Judas continues. What we know is that it challenged traditional Christianity and presented Judas in a completely different light. But was this gospel the only one that was hidden? If there are other ancient texts still concealed, what more could they reveal? The past still holds many secrets. The truth may be buried in caves, hidden in monasteries, or locked away in places we could never imagine. The search goes on. The Gospel of Judas may have disappeared once, but will it vanish forever? Or will history one day be forced to rewrite its own truths? In every era of history, there are documents that seem to pass through the centuries like shadows. They leave no concrete proof of their existence, yet they remain alive in rumors, fragments, and mysterious citations. The Gospel of Judas was one of those documents. Even before its physical discovery in 1978, it was already mentioned in writings from the 2nd century. A man named Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the early bishops of the church, wrote about it in a text called Against Heresies, dated around 180 AD. Irenaeus not only confirmed the gospel existed, but also condemned it, calling it dangerous and heretical. But what bothered Irenaeus so much? What was in this gospel that made it so unbearable to the early leaders of the church? The answer lay in the way Judas was portrayed. While Christian tradition painted him as the ultimate villain, the traitor cursed for all eternity, the Gospel of Judas suggested something very different. In it, Judas was not an ordinary traitor. He was the only disciple who fully understood Jesus, the only one capable of accepting the most difficult mission of all, handing over his master so that the divine plan could be fulfilled. For the emerging church, this vision was a mortal threat. If Judas was seen as a divine instrument and not as a cursed traitor, it would change the entire understanding of sin, redemption, and sacrifice. That's why Irenaeus attacked this gospel so fiercely. He needed to kill it, not just physically, but spiritually. And so the Gospel of Judas became a kind of ghost gospel. It disappeared, but it continued to exist in the margins of history. A forbidden echo of a truth no one wanted to be heard. After Irenaeus' words, the Gospel of Judas sank into silence. For centuries, it was considered lost. Theologians and historians referenced its existence as an academic curiosity, something that may have never existed at all. But the absence of a document does not mean it never existed. Ancient manuscripts often do not disappear. They simply wait, hidden in forgotten libraries, buried caves, or private collections, and the Gospel of Judas silently waited. Desert monks, anonymous guardians, scholars who collected forbidden texts, they all knew something so dangerous could never be completely destroyed. Because forbidden knowledge is valuable knowledge. The greater the risk, the greater the value. And for almost 2,000 years, this gospel was a secret guarded with the very blood of those who dared to protect it, until one day, it resurfaced. In 1978, a forgotten cave in Egypt revealed a silent treasure. Among fragments of ancient texts, a particular scroll stood out. It was damaged, but something in its words caught the attention of researchers. It was different. This text did not speak about the crucifixion as we know it. It spoke about a celestial conspiracy, about a misunderstood disciple. And then scholars realized what they were holding. The Gospel of Judas had returned, but its return was not celebrated by everyone, because truth is not always welcome. For many, it would have been better if it had remained lost, because its content challenged centuries of religious tradition, and every word was a threat to the official narrative. Translating the Gospel of Judas was not just a linguistic challenge, it was a battle against fear, the fear of what might be revealed. The translators knew they were not just handling a historical text, They were touching something sacred and dangerous. Every line rewrote the role of Judas. Every sentence suggested that the greatest villain of Christian history might have been its greatest hero. But how do you tell this story to the world? How do you tell billions of believers that Judas might have been the only one who truly understood Jesus? The scholars knew they were stepping onto sacred and explosive ground. And yet, the truth had to be told. History is written by the victors, and in the case of Christianity, the official version was shaped in councils, theological treaties, and the political decisions of emperors and popes. The story of Judas that reached us is not the only version. It is simply the chosen version. Other stories were silenced, other voices were erased, but truth has a curious way of surviving. It hides in the margins of official texts, in the whispers of forgotten heresies, in buried documents. And now, after centuries of silence, the Gospel of Judas speaks again. But the question remains, are we ready to listen? Because the truth it carries might hold the key to understanding not just Judas, but the very nature of faith, betrayal, and redemption. Judas did not betray Jesus for money. He handed him over because Jesus himself asked him to. He was not the villain. He was the only friend brave enough to obey. And if this story is true, then the greatest betrayal in history might actually be the greatest act of faith ever recorded. The story of Judas is the story of an impossible choice. The official story taught us to see Judas Iscariot as the man who sold his own master in exchange for a handful of coins, a traitor driven by greed and corruption. That image was repeated for centuries in sermons, paintings, homilies, and even in the words recorded in the surviving scriptures. But the Gospel of Judas presents something disturbingly different. In it, Judas does not act out of self-interest. He does not betray Jesus because he desires wealth or power. He hands him over because he believes he is fulfilling the will of his own master. If this version is true, then the entire theology built around Judas's role collapses, because in this case the betrayal is not a betrayal at all, but rather an act of extreme obedience. If Jesus truly asked to be handed over, Judas would have been the only disciple who understood the secret plan. This transforms Judas not into a traitor, but into the most faithful disciple of all. And this reversal of roles is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous for any religious power structure built upon guilt and redemption. The image of Judas as a villain has always been convenient, a perfect enemy, a representation of sin and treason. But what if Judas was none of those things? What if deep down, he was the only one brave enough to obey? The battle for control over religious narratives didn't begin in modern times. It started in the earliest centuries of Christianity, when different groups fought to interpret and preserve the message of Jesus. There were the apostles, the direct followers of Christ who had walked beside him. But there were also the first bishops, who began to organize Christian communities. And there were the Gnostics, groups who believed that Jesus had left behind secret teachings, knowledge that only a few disciples truly understood. The Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic text. It is not a simple chronicle of Jesus' life, but rather a deep dive into hidden teachings, mystical visions, and secret interpretations. That makes it very different from the canonical Gospels. While Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are public narratives, the Gospel of Judas is a private revelation, an internal message meant only for those who had already reached an advanced level of spiritual understanding. And that difference is crucial to understanding why it disappeared. This gospel wasn't rejected only because it presented Judas as a hero. It was rejected because it taught that salvation came through hidden knowledge, not through blind obedience to the emerging church authorities. That was the real danger, a gospel that taught people to seek truth directly, with no intermediaries, no priests, no stone temples. The word heresy did not exist in the earliest days of Christianity. In the years following the crucifixion, there was a plurality of ideas and interpretations about who Jesus was and what his true message meant. The Christians in Alexandria thought one way, the Christians in Antioch another, the Christians in Judea yet another. But when Christianity began to institutionalize, that diversity became a problem. A unified doctrine was needed, an official narrative. And it was at this point that the concept of heresy was born. Any interpretation that deviated from the official line would be condemned. Texts that contradicted the official narrative would be destroyed, and those who dared to preserve those texts would be persecuted. This is how the Gospel of Judas disappeared. It wasn't lost by accident. It was deliberately erased because its message was too dangerous. And so Judas was condemned forever, not because that was the truth, but because that was the version needed to keep power in the right hands. For nearly 800 years, the Gospel of Judas remained silent, until in a cave in Egypt, a team of explorers found a codex corroded by time containing the lost text. When scholars began translating it, the shock was immediate, the words emerging from that ancient parchment completely rewrote the story we thought we knew. There was Judas, not as a villain, but as an enlightened disciple capable of understanding secrets no one else had grasped. He knew Jesus had to die to fulfill his true destiny, and Jesus trusted only him for that mission. Every line of that text challenged centuries of doctrine. Every word chipped away at the foundations of the official narrative, and suddenly, history's greatest betrayal seemed, in fact, to be the greatest act of faith ever recorded. But not everyone welcomed this discovery. When the Gospel of Judas came to light, the attacks began. Scholars linked to traditional religious institutions tried to discredit the text. They claimed it was a forgery, a late heresy invented by dissidents. After all, accepting this gospel would mean reopening ancient wounds. It would mean admitting that Judas's story had been manipulated for centuries. And worse, it would mean that Christianity itself was born from a carefully constructed narrative, tailored to serve human interests, not just spiritual ones. Accepting the Gospel of Judas would open the door to questioning everything. Who decided? Which texts would make it into the Bible? How many other Gospels were destroyed? What truths were buried? And if Judas was saved, how many other names were unjustly condemned? To accept this Gospel is to accept that the story we know is just a convenient version of the truth. And the truth, as we know, is not always comfortable, but it always finds a way to emerge. Even after almost 2,000 years, Judas has spoken again. And now, it is up to us to decide, will we listen to his version, or will we keep repeating the story we were taught? Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, the fight for control of the narrative has been relentless. The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were chosen not only for their content, but also because they reinforced the vision of the emerging church. But there were other texts, like the Gospel of Judas, that presented a different perspective and were condemned to oblivion. The decision to exclude certain Gospels and preserve others was not an accident. It was part of a deliberate project to shape the religion according to the political and theological interests of the time. If the Gospel of Judas had been accepted, Judas's image would have been rehabilitated. Betrayal would no longer be betrayal. And even worse, the idea that only a small group of ecclesiastical leaders could interpret Christ's message would collapse. Because the Gospel of Judas suggested that the true understanding of faith was not found in dogmas, but in hidden knowledge, and for a church seeking to consolidate power, that was unacceptable. History is shaped by those who hold power, and the history of Christianity was no different. Over the centuries, councils were convened to define what was orthodox and what was heresy. In the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea established the foundations of Christianity as we know it today. Alternative gospels were rejected, Gnostic texts were burned, and dissident Christian groups were persecuted. Truth had to be unique, absolute, indisputable, but truth, by its very nature, can never be completely erased. It survives in the dark corners of history, waiting to be rediscovered, and the Gospel of Judas is proof of that. Even after centuries of oblivion, it emerged to challenge the official version of events. If we accept that the exclusion of the Gospel of Judas was deliberate, an inevitable question arises. What else was hidden? We know that throughout the Middle Ages, ancient manuscripts were either destroyed or locked away in inaccessible libraries. The Vatican's secret archives contain documents that have never been revealed to the public. Some researchers believe that among those documents are Gospels, letters, and records that could change our understanding of early Christianity. And what if there are records about Judas himself in those archives? What if there are documents proving that the church always knew about the existence of this gospel but chose to suppress it? If that is true, then we are facing one of the greatest historical manipulations of all time. The question is, will these truths ever be revealed, or will they remain hidden like so many other secrets buried by time? Even in the darkest periods of history, there were always those who tried to preserve forbidden knowledge. Monks copied texts hidden in remote monasteries. Gnostic communities tried to keep their beliefs alive despite persecution. The Cathars, a medieval Christian group, held a view of Christianity that resembled Gnostic teachings, and for that, they were massacred by the Inquisition. And even today, there are researchers and historians dedicated to finding and preserving these lost texts. The problem is that power always resists change, and there are many interests invested in keeping certain truths buried. But history shows us that no secret can stay hidden forever. And if there is one thing we have learned from the Gospel of Judas, it is that truth always finds a way to emerge. Judas Iscariot was condemned by history as the greatest traitor of all time. But the Gospel of Judas forces us to ask, was that condemnation fair? If this gospel is correct, then Judas was not a traitor, but rather the only disciple who truly understood Jesus. If that is true, then the greatest injustice in Christianity was not the crucifixion of Christ. It was the condemnation of Judas. And that changes everything, because it means that for centuries we have repeated a story that may not be true. It means we have judged a man based on a constructed narrative, not on facts. And it means that perhaps there are still hidden truths waiting to be discovered. If there is one thing this gospel teaches us, it is that history is never as simple as it seems, and that truth, even when forgotten, never truly disappears. It merely waits for the right moment to be revealed. Among all the figures present in the Gospels, none is as burdened with hatred and contempt as Judas Iscariot. His name has crossed the centuries as a synonym for betrayal and disloyalty. But the Gospel of Judas proposes something almost impossible to accept. What if Judas was chosen precisely because of his courage? In the text, it is Jesus himself who selects him, not as an enemy, but as someone capable of understanding the true mission. While the other disciples saw Jesus as a political liberator or an earthly king, Judas saw something much greater. He understood that Jesus' destiny was not just to live, but to die. And more than that, his death required someone willing to pull the trigger. That role was given to Judas. Instead of being a traitor, Judas was the only one brave enough to accept the task no one else wanted, to obey the Master, even knowing it would mean being hated forever. How many of us would be capable of bearing such a burden? Christianity is a religion built on the concept of sacrifice. Jesus sacrificed his life to save humanity, but the Gospel of Judas forces us to look deeper. Judas also sacrificed something: his own name, his honor, his memory. He accepted the weight of betrayal so that God's will could be fulfilled. And the price of that sacrifice was to be condemned by history. No other disciple paid such a high price. Peter denied Christ, but was forgiven and became the cornerstone of the church. Thomas doubted, but his skepticism became a symbol of the search for concrete proof. But Judas, the one who did exactly what? The Master asked, was erased, demonized, turned into the greatest villain of the Christian faith. If this is true, then the injustice committed against Judas still echoes today. History is always written by the victors. When the official church consolidated, it needed clear symbols. Christ would be the Savior. Peter would be the rock of the church. And Judas would be the eternal villain, the condemned traitor. This narrative served a purpose: to create an internal enemy, an archetypal traitor, someone to embody everything that was forbidden and abominable. But the Gospel of Judas tells a different version. And that's precisely why it had to disappear. It was a threat to the constructed narrative, because if Judas was not a villain, the entire structure of guilt and redemption would collapse. Without a traitor, Christ's sacrifice would lose its symmetry. Without Judas's guilt, the very need for an intermediary church between God and men would be weakened. This gospel was not just a theological disagreement, it was a bomb aimed at the very foundation of the institution, and bombs like that are not allowed. Even after its ordered destruction, the Gospel of Judas survived in the shadows. Hidden copies were preserved for centuries, protected by dissident monks, guarded in secret libraries, or buried in forgotten caves. The one who found the codex in the 1970s didn't know what they had in their hands. But those who studied the text knew exactly what it represented. It was not just an ancient document, it was a cry from the past, challenging everything we were taught about betrayal, faith, and truth. But even after being translated, the Gospel of Judas continued to be silenced. Few have ever heard of it, and many of those who did were taught to doubt its authenticity. After all, admitting it could be real means admitting the official story might be wrong, and that is something few are willing to do. Judas was condemned by the court of history, but that trial was based on a selective version of the facts. The Gospel of Judas is the defense argument that was never read in court. It is the testimony that was ignored, the voice silenced by political and religious convenience. And now, after almost 2,000 years, that voice has returned to echo once more. Are we ready to reopen this case? Do we have the courage to review this trial? Because if the Gospel of Judas is true, we will have to admit something uncomfortable. We condemned an innocent man. We turned a faithful disciple into the greatest villain of Christian history. And we built an entire religion upon that condemnation. But history is stubborn, and the truth, no matter how hard they try to bury it, always finds a way to breathe again. The disappearance of the Gospel of Judas was not a historical accident. It was intentionally erased because it contained a version of the story that those in power did not want to preserve. But now, even after almost 2,000 years, it has returned. Not as an ordinary archaeological document, but as a key that challenges everything we thought we knew. This gospel is not just an alternative narrative, it is a mirror where we can see how history was shaped and distorted to serve a narrative of control. Judas was condemned not because he betrayed Jesus, but because his true story threatened the entire structure the church built over the centuries. The true legacy of Judas is the legacy of someone who chose to obey the truth, even knowing he would be hated for it. And that courage is much harder to accept than simply labeling him a traitor. The truth about Judas and his gospel raises an uncomfortable question. How many other stories have been manipulated? How many other biblical figures were turned into villains or heroes according to the political and religious needs of each era? And what if Judas wasn't the only one betrayed by history? If the Gospel of Judas was banned because it revealed an inconvenient truth, what other texts might have suffered the same fate? Gospels that exalted Mary Magdalene as an important apostle. Texts that suggested the true kingdom of God was not earthly, but internal. Writings that questioned the authority of religious leaders and encouraged each person to seek their own direct connection with the divine. The Gospel of Judas is just a crack in a wall built to hide these questions. But every crack is a door waiting to be opened. Throughout history, the guardians of memory decided what deserved to be remembered and what needed to be forgotten. These guardians were kings, emperors, popes, inquisitors, and even modern scholars. Every time a gospel disappeared, a door to the past was shut. But history is stubborn, and the Gospel of Judas escaped this controlled oblivion. It survived because it was hidden, not only in caves and codices, but also in the memory of those who knew that every story has more than one side. And when it resurfaced, it brought with it an uncomfortable truth. No official version is ever final. History is a battlefield where memory is constantly shaped and reshaped, and when a forgotten text reappears, it carries a dangerous power. The power to remember what we prefer to forget. Judas is the most human character in the Gospels. He makes mistakes, hesitates, feels fear. He is capable of betrayal and of regret. But according to the forbidden gospel, Judas is also the only one who understands the true meaning of Jesus' mission. Not because he was the holiest, but because he was the only one capable of understanding that the truth is not always beautiful, nor always glorious. Judas represents the human side of faith, the side that faces impossible moral dilemmas. Anyone who has ever stood before a choice they knew would destroy them, but still had to make, understands Judas's pain. Maybe that's why it's so easy to hate him, because in him we see the reflection of our own weakness. But if the Gospel of Judas is right, Judas was not weak. He was strong enough to accept being hated forever in the name of a truth only he and his master knew. Now that the Gospel of Judas has come back into the light, history can never be told the same way again. We can ignore it, discredit it, call it false, heretical, or irrelevant. But it exists, and its very existence changes everything. Because it reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a complex web full of hidden and silenced versions. Judas was condemned, erased, and cursed, but now he speaks, and each of us will have to decide what to do with his voice. The question is, do we have the courage to listen to the forgotten side of history? Because listening to Judas means questioning everything we were taught, and that perhaps is the real reason his gospel disappeared.